30.
It's October 31. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko, and now the East Europe Foundation presents a study of Ukraine's civil society sector during the war. Let me introduce my speakers. Today it's Viktor Lyakh, President of the East Europe Foundation, Olga Voytovych, Phoenix Project Management at the East Europe Foundation, Lyubov Margolina, Program Development Monitoring and Evaluation Manager at Eastern Europe Foundation, Victoria Skorbota, Head of Business Development at Force Service Group, and Olena Bikla, co-author of the study and Force Service Group expert. So, Ms. Olga, before we proceed to the presentation of the study, we understand that within the last year and a half, the role of the civil sector has grown significantly, so we want to understand the urgency of this research. We want to understand how the growth of their role influenced our society. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon to those who listen to us. Today we will present the research on the civil society sector during the war, and we want to emphasize the second part of this period, and it's important for us to track the dynamics of changes going on in all spheres of Ukrainian society. The research was done by Force Service upon the request of East Europe Foundation as a part of the Phoenix project funded by the European Union, and today we will tell you about the key results of the study, which highlight the changes in the work of the civil society as well as needs of the organizations, their organizational capacity, with a focus on the second year of the full-scale invasion. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Viktor, proceeding to the research itself, what were the changes that took place in the Ukrainian society, in the civil organizations? Who are they today, those civil organizations? Are they the agents of the reforms? Are they the advocates of the public opinion or anything else? All those things you've listed, but they also cover a huge spectrum of humanitarian activities. They support the internally displaced persons. But first of all, I would like to tell you how we came up with this idea, and we want to thank everybody who is watching this broadcast. For us as a East Europe Foundation, the priority is the development of civil organizations. We've supported more than 300 civil organizations since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We were supporting their work in social services, legal services, education services, humanitarian ones, and so on and so forth. We were supporting an extensive number of organizations to make sure that they can help the whole country during this fight against Russian aggression. And it was interesting for us to study the challenges, the problems, and the prospects for the civil sector, significantly, especially those, which arise today. All the service providers, universities, educational institutions, donors, and other organizations which support the development of other organizations, so that we could use the most efficient and rational way to help the organizations that work now at the level of the communities, directly providing services to the target audiences they work with. And I incredibly appreciate the input of our colleagues from Force Service. I want to thank them for their work. They will talk about very interesting things today. They will present the study and tell you about the methodology. And I have to say that some figures rejoiced me a lot. A lot of organizations continue their work. It's incredibly pleasant to see that the civil sector of Ukraine has become an active actor in resistance, and they help the whole country to overcome the consequences of the aggression. What was of my concern was the fact that 25% of the organizations unfortunately were not able to implement a single project during the full-scale invasion. and today my colleagues will tell you about the reasons why those organizations fail to implement any projects. We were asking the organizations what they need, and among the most widespread problems is the lack of funding, but it was not the only problem mentioned by our respondents. I would like to draw your attention to a problem that is of concern to many organizations. It's the lack of staff. 80% of organizations mentioned that they lack program managers, financial managers, monitoring and assessment managers. We understand why, because a lot of people have left, they work remotely, they cannot fulfill their functions to the full extent. But if we transform this demand into an opportunity, I would like to ask all the service providers, maybe universities, education service providers, to see it as the opportunity to prepare new staff for civil sector. It can become a new niche for work in Ukraine, and I would like to urge all the civil organizations to check out the results of this research, because it's important to see the problems that your colleagues in your sector are facing, and maybe it can help you find the solution, how to overcome those problems, those obstacles. And maybe if it's something inherent in the sector, maybe we should pay attention to building the strategy of mitigation of risks for other civil organizations. I incredibly appreciate all the support of European Union in Ukraine. They help us to study civil sector and develop it. And what I would like to add, we have no other way than to be strong and capable. We have certain recipes, certain ideas that we want to share with you today. We want to share the ideas on overcoming the problems that we have on development of the civil sector. So please share your ideas with us too. Empower the civil sector, because again, we have no other way than being strong and capable. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Miss Victoria, Miss Olena, you were the ones who were preparing this research indirectly. So what was the task? What was the goal? What were the main challenges on the way of preparation of this study? Well, first of all, I want to express my appreciation of this opportunity to do this research for you. It's our contribution to make sure that our organizations work to the extent, to the most efficient extent possible, to make sure they have roadmaps, they know what direction they should be going to. Our goal was to find out what are the needs, what are the problems of the charity foundations, of the civil organizations, both inside and outside. It was a complex research. I think we may put the next slide on the screen. So this study was of complex nature. It was made in two stages. First one was a research in the offices. We were studying the organizations on the registers, what registers exist, what are the skills, knowledge and training programs available now. And another stage, next stage, was a quality research. We've interviewed 37 respondents, and it was quite an intense group. We interviewed 5 representatives of businesses who closely cooperate with the civil organizations. We've interviewed 7 experts. We've interviewed 20 representatives of civil organizations, and the quantity stage. And on the quantity stage, we've interviewed 601 respondents. All of them were representatives of civil organizations, and we had a very diverse audience. Our goal was to interview civil organizations in all regions of Ukraine, and we've made it. On top of that, we had different things that we that we were building our methodology upon. First, the organizations were required to implement at least one project within the last 3 years, so they shouldn't be dormant organizations. We were asking the managers and chief officers of the organizations who build the strategy and who know from the inside what's missing the most. And we were interviewing the organizations that were recently created during the war, as well as organizations which work for a long time in the territory of Ukraine and deal with different types of activities. One of such insights that we were able to come up with, not the results, but the results of the interview, basically, not the results of the study. First of all, we realized that the people have something to say and they want to be heard, and it works the best when you talk personally. So it's either in-depth interview or telephone interviews. Unfortunately, there is no such trust window, joint trust window for civil organizations when you can interview them online and they tell you honestly. Moreover, the interviews were going on within some period, it takes certain time. And we hope that the results that we obtained will be of use. And talking about the insights, I would like to give the floor to Olena, and she will tell you in detail. Well, Miss Olena, yes, we are really expecting to hear about some very special things during this research. Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be able to present this research for you, because being immersed in the environment, having those conversations, honest and frank conversations, everybody was open and transparent. They were telling us about the vision of the sector development, their capabilities, everything. It's very interesting. And 1 hour or 1 hour and a half of interviews, it was like a small series, like a whole show. And I want to thank you for watching this presentation, because it means you don't only work in the fields, but you are curious about the tendencies of the development of the sector. You want to find out about the others to make things better on your end. So we were using one of the methods such as self-assessment, when, for example, we were asking 20 organizations to assess their capabilities before the full-scale invasion and after it. And as I said, it was an honest assessment. We were asking the donor organizations what's going on in the sector, but it was an average temperature in the hospital, body temperature. But when we tried to balance it, when we were doing the calculations, we found out that it was not average, but rather conversion tendencies. You know that donors, they assess their organizations better than the organizations do assess themselves, and we use the resource-based approach when an interview itself is a resource, as a knowledge. And I would like to recommend the representatives of those civil organizations which give interview to ask for the record of that interview, because everything you're saying within an hour or hour and a half is an element of a strategic session for you, and you can debrief your team with that and to investigate it, because you work with a specialist who guides you along some questions. Even in case of telephone interviews, the moderators don't see it, but through the phone the people get immersed in it and they tell it as if during a confession. So those interviews are a resource for the organizations themselves. And obviously any quality study, I was just working with quality studies, so it has some therapeutic effect. The representatives of the organizations shared their concerns. One of the representatives of the civil organizations who were involved in religious activities, they even blessed me, so it was of therapeutic effect for me. So there are things to read, to analyze, to compare with your organization, even if you were not part of this research. So please compare it with you. Use those opportunities. The fact that we've covered a lot of field work, this research, previous researches fulfilled by other organizations, because it's a point of growth for your organization and the sector in general. Thank you very much, Ms. Olga. So let's proceed directly to the results of the survey. So what were your conclusions? Well, let's stop at the main results of the study. And first of all, we were asking civil organizations what they were facing with the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We see those figures on the slide now. The majority of the organizations never relocated. Less than 10% were relocated. However, 30% of the employees of those civil organizations had to change their places of residence. I have to say that the consequences of COVID-19 pandemics assisted to the people in this issue, because when the representatives of civil organizations were forced to work remotely, they were ready to fulfill their activities even in different time zones, and at the same moment less than 1/5 of the civil organizations mentioned the change of their activity. They got adapted to the conditions of the war, and we're talking about the second year of the full-scale invasion. The experts of the organizations emphasized the change of focus of civil organizations in those areas mostly affected by the war, and intensification of activity in communities, emergence of such phenomena as networking with the civil activists staying abroad. The main area of activity of organizations as of June 23 was humanitarian aid and volunteer activities, training and consultations, analytics, research, rehabilitation. The highest percentage is in the eastern part. 54% of the organizations are active compared to other regions. In the western regions, the accent is on social services and volunteer activities, 36 and 37% respectively. Also, on the next slide, we're seeing 5 sources of funding. In order not to repeat ourselves, we have to say that the sources of funding are unstable. Organizations don't have enough resources to maintain the staff. The majority of the civil organizations mentioned that on a constant basis, the salary is being paid only to accountants and other members only on a project-to-project basis, which results in change of staff in the civil sector. And about the administration of civil expenses such as logistic expenses and maintenance of offices, they are a constant search of resources because the civil organizations find it difficult covering those expenses. We know that project activity only helps to cover those expenses in part during the project implementation and operation. So social entrepreneurship could be a solution, but to start a social business, we need quite a significant financial foundation. And to start the social entrepreneurship is not something that civil organizations can do right away. The priorities of donors have shifted too, and social entrepreneurship is not like untimely, but this focus shifted significantly. And yet another problem is that there is really lack of specialists and lack of knowledge on fundraising. Then talking about the project activity, it was important for us to understand what was the number of projects operating in the civil organizations and what is the specifics of such projects. So as Viktor mentioned, A quarter of the organizations, civil society organizations, have not implemented a single project since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and only 17% of the organizations received international financial support. Statistically, saying the meaning of this percentage was identified with those respondents who were relocated. So 29% of the organizations that were relocated received the grants of international support, and also the grants were extended to those civil organizations who changed the focus of their activity. And those details really makes us ponder over a question: why those civil organizations did not receive funding since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So talking about the responses of the respondents, why they did not submit for donor funding, the reason was the absence of project managers, absence of resources they could submit for project activity, or work overload. Other big civil organizations who are involved in humanitarian projects, they did not submit for other projects in other sectors. And unfortunately, some civil organizations mentioned that they do not believe that they can obtain a grant in a transparent manner. So grant funds were aimed to support the vulnerable categories of population, integration of internally displaced individuals, organization of training programs, and raising awareness of different groups of population. So talking about target audience, for whom those projects were implemented, they were mostly involved in work with the youth, internally displaced persons, disabled individuals, children, and the least attention was paid to representatives of LGBT community, orphans, veterans of war, and their families. Within our research, we were trying to find out how the organizations assess their institutional capability, because it's important too, and we were studying the availability of rules and procedures available in the organization, situation with the outsourced specialists in the organizations, and we've also received the data about the different competencies and areas of work. So on the next slide, we can see that the organizations assessed the communication, protection of personal data, program management, and human resources management, because there was, but we'll get back to it later, because there were questions asked, the similar questions asked in a different way, and the respondents responded them differently, which is evidenced by the results of the study. There are different other aspects, such as involvement of resources or high technologies, and organizations have difficulties with this. We were mentioning fundraising, financial management, monitoring of management, and at the same time, almost half of the interviewed civil organizations don't have formulated policies and procedures. Meanwhile, they are exactly what helps the organizations to arrange the processes, and many donors require those rules and procedures to be clearly formulated by civil organizations. A little number of civil organizations have provisions on monitoring and assessment or fundraising policies. As I've mentioned, those spheres are the least developed, according even to the responses of the participants of the research. But such documents as Statute of Association or the plan, so only 44% of the organizations have it. 41% have the communications plan that defines the way the civil organization communicates with their target audience. Another huge challenge is the critical lack of specialists in the civil sector. We see that 80% of those interviewed don't have 85% don't have fundraisers, 83% don't have specialists in procurement, and they are the key experts in the area of audit and financial resources, financial reporting. 81% report the lack of specialists on assessment, then specialists in communications, accountants, or financial managers. So let's talk about the needs and problems of the organizations, and here let me start with the internal problems such as lack of funding, weak material base, and emotional burden. And there are challenges by macro regions and time frame of creation of civil organizations. So talking about the lack of funding, it's the problem mostly experienced by the organizations created since after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and those who work since, for example, year 2001 experienced it the least. And the biggest indicator of emotional burden was indicated by representatives of those civil organizations created during the period from 2012 until 2021. And emotional burden is also inherent in those organizations that were relocated, because they, apart from relocation, need to find funding for networking and reestablishment of their activities in the new places of operation. Among top 7 problems, what was mentioned was the low support from the local government and support of other donors and businesses. Well, the respondents think that their capability may grow thanks to the growth of financing or training. This is the response of 33% of respondents, and consulting 23% of respondents. The organizations identify those needs that correlate with the demand for training, and many organizations of the civil society are interested in support or assistance in building the financial plans, trainings in fundraisers, and support of other civil organizations. However, more and more events are happening now online for the civil sector, but still several organizations mention that sharing experience is not enough. They want more such events. And the lack of knowledge on project activity is something that is inherent in newly created civil organizations. For them, of interest are draw up of projects, building relations with the civil organizations, businesses, and government. Among those who are located in the west of Ukraine, urgent is the study of the foreign languages and producing reports. Also, participation in the projects of institutional support is important for us, and they are ready to take part in such projects. That was the response of 74% of the respondents. As to the role of the civil organizations in reconstruction of the country, they continue being very active players even now, and those territories that were liberated, the civil organizations either quickly return there or they organize a lot of work on recovery of those regions. 90% of the respondents are ready to take part in the recovery of Ukraine and to participate in the projects of recovery. The respondents are missing such key factors as funding, that's obvious. Then the end of the war, well, as you see, it's not the prevailing response, so the civil organizations don't wait for the war to end. They are already taking an active part in recovery of Ukraine. So the end of the war is an important factor, but not the most important. Also, they lack support by the government. Less organizations mention lack of time, or experience, or knowledge. And talking about the role of the organizations in the recovery of the country, the respondents see it as follows. First is the humanitarian response, education services, social protection, psychological support, information field, analysis of responses of civil organizations, or the responses to this question demonstrates their vision of the role of the civil organizations of Ukraine. For example, those which were founded before the year 2000 and after the year 22 prefer the recovery of infrastructure. Talking about macro regions, it's the east and south of Ukraine. Those there are the organizations who mentioned their participation in recovery of infrastructure. And talking about psychological support, that area was mentioned mostly by newer organizations, specifically those created within the period from 2020 to 2023, and by the regions it's mostly the western region. The organizations founded after the year 2001 mentioned education services as one of the main areas of their activity, and generally talking about the recovery of infrastructure. And I would like to mention that these two issues, infrastructure recovery and psychological support, are two areas which were mentioned as the areas of the highest priority during reconstruction, and civil organizations are ready to get involved one way or another in those initiatives, not depending on the time of their establishment, of their founding, and the region of their activity. You can get familiarized with the full text of research using this QR code. I also want to mention that the research is available in English language for global audience, because I know the results of such research are of importance to our international colleagues. So using this QR code, you can get the research in Ukrainian. On the East Europe website, you can find the text of the research in English language. We invite you to get familiarized, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you very much. So we are curious about the fate of this research, Ms. Lyubov. What will it be used for later on? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Those researches are very important for us to understand how the civil organizations feel in the environment of the changing context. The development of the civil organizations is a goal of work of the East Europe Foundation. We work with a lot of organizations for a long time, and what we see is the changes. They are dynamic, and some of the results of such study, they were to some extent predictable, and others I personally was surprised with them. It was expected to see the organizations complaining for the problems with funding, but what's interesting, 32% of the organizations mentioned that they require support with training. Meanwhile, 23% mentioned that they need advice services or consulting services. So the organizations realize that they are lacking knowledge and skills. We realize that not all the organizations with the beginning of the full-scale invasion were able to implement certain projects. It was said today already that 25% of the organizations have not fulfilled a single project within these years, and yet another important factor for me personally was that only 17% of the organizations received international technical support, which is a very small percentage. Now the attention of all the global community is at Ukraine, and I encourage all the organizations to use those opportunities. The donors are there because you know, it's a pity not to use those opportunities. And talking about the East Europe Fund, as Viktor said, since the beginning of the war, we supported more than 300 civil organizations. We have different programs in place. For example, within the framework of Phoenix program, within which this research was conducted, we've supported 17 civil organizations. 11 more are supposed to receive or are about to receive institutional support. We have other programs in place, programs aimed at different organizations. So what's important about those programs is that we not only issue grants, we also help the organizations in their development. For example, such organizations that receive our grants undergo the assessment of organizational capability, when they can assess themselves, where they can understand the gaps, where they can understand the ways they should be moving to. We offer different training courses, educational services, so I encourage the organizations to use that free resources offered by East Europe site. It's our online platform Zrozumilo. Any organization will find free, easily accessible training courses on such important topics as monitoring, psychological support, or grant writing, which is very important too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let us give the opportunity to our journalists to ask their questions if there are any. Good afternoon, Olena Bikla, Ukrinform. I apologize if it does not relate to the topic of your research, but did you try to find out the statistics about the organizations that were closed during the war and the number of the new organizations that started working in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion? Thank you. Let me try to answer. So we were researching the patterns of behavior of civil organizations. We did not find a large number of civil organizations who cease their activities, because to terminate the activity of a civil organizations, you have to exercise some legal actions, and the organizations just prefer to suspend the operation of the activity. So there was no dramatic number of closed civil organizations. We will study this problem with the number of new organizations opening, but probably they had difficulties with registration of new organizations because there is a number of obstacles related to relocation now and drop of documents. So now it looks a little bit more complicated, but thank you for your question. Also, we can consider volunteer initiatives that were not institutionalized as new civil organizations. They find funding not maybe at the expense of the donors, but this is the new phenomena that emerged in the Ukrainian civil society. The volunteer initiatives, obviously not of them get registered as civil organizations, but they probably may implement their activities within some existing organizations. So you know, now there is no such divide as new or old civil organizations, but they all undergo the transformation. Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I would like to thank our speakers for presentation of this very interesting research, which demonstrated the work of our civil organizations. And Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform is getting back online at 15:30, and we will be talking with the Lieutenant Colonel Volodymyr Fityo, head of the Public Relations Service at the Land Forces Command. Stay tuned.